Hey everyone, welcome to part 102 of my Pokemon game series in Unity. So in this video, we'll implement a generic selector component which we can use to handle all the selection in our game. So we just have to build it once and we can reuse its code for all the selection. So this will make our code a lot more cleaner and easier to maintain. And the generic selector will also work really well with our state stack architecture. We'll also add joystick support to our generic selector. So let's look at how to implement this. By the way, I started a new series on Patreon that covers how to make a 3D Pokemon game like Pokemon Legends Arceus in Unity. So if you're interested in making a 3D Pokemon game or a 3D RPG game in general, then you can check out this course on Patreon. So by becoming a Patreon, you can support this channel and get access to the 3D Pokemon series and get some other cool rewards like the complete project files of the series, some exclusive tutorials, and access to the Discord community. So before we start, I want to say a huge thanks to all the Patreons who are currently supporting the channel. You guys make the series possible, and I'm grateful to each and every one of you. So let's start the video. So before we start implementing our generic selection UI, I want to first show you what's the problem with our current approach of handling selections. So let me open the battle system script, and here we're handling lots of selections like action selection, move selection, party selection, and all that. Okay. So the thing is, the code for handling the selection is pretty much the same, right? The only difference is the variable that we're incrementing is different, and the action performed when a selection is made is also different, right? But the rest of the code is pretty much the same. So here we're just repeating the same piece of code for all selections. So that's not a good approach. One of the main principles of clean coding practices is do not repeat yourself. Okay. So the reason why it's bad is because let's say you want to make some changes to how the selection works. So for example, let's say you want to add controller support to the selection. So you'll have to go ahead and change the code in all the selection areas, right? So that is the problem with repeating your code. So we need to find some way to write this code once and reuse it for all our selection logic. So that's exactly what we are going to do with our generic selection UI class. So let's start implementing our generic selection UI. So first, in the util folder under scripts, I'll create a new folder called generic selection UI. Okay. And in here, I'll create a class called selection UI. So here, let me just get rid of the default code. And I also want to put this in a namespace so that it doesn't clash with any other libraries, since this is going to be a library that we can use in multiple games. Okay, so I'll put it in a namespace like this. So the selection UI class is going to have a list of items through which we can select, right? So in this game, most of our selection happens through the text. So most of the time we are just selecting through a list of text and we are changing the color of the selected text to a different highlighted color. So here, if we want, we can just maintain a list of text and do our selection through that. But I don't want to do it like this. The reason is because not all our selection UI won't be selecting through a text, right? Some selection UI might be different. For example, in the 3D Pokemon course, I'll be using a selection UI like this, where each item is a button. And when I change the selection, I'm actually changing the background of the button. Okay, so it's not just selecting through text like we're doing in this game. So here, I want to build a generic library that I can use in multiple games of mine, not just in this game. So I'm not going to use text here. Instead, what I'll do is I'll make this class a generic class and I'll use that as our list of items through which we will select. Okay, so now we'll be able to select through any things that we want. So let me just name this list as items. And then I'll also create a float variable that will store the currently selected item. Okay. So next, I'm going to create the handle update function that will be handling our selection. Okay. And I'll just make this function virtual just in case we want to override the default selection behavior of the selection UI. Okay. But most of the times we'll just be using this function. So in here, we have to write the selection code that we have been using for all our selection till now. But we have two types of selection. One type is where we select through a grid like this. Okay. So in this case, we can also press right and left arrow to select left and right. So I'm going to call this grid selection. And then we also have a type where we just select through a list. So example for that is the menu controller. So there we can only press up and down arrows and select up and down. We can't select left and right since it's not a grid. So we have to handle two types of selection here. One is list selection and the other one is grid selection. So we'll start by implementing the list selection and we'll implement the grid selection in a future video. Okay, so I'll just separate the logic into a different function. Let me just call this handle list selection. Okay, so I'm just separating it to a different function so that we can easily switch between list and grid selection. All right, so here we can use this logic where we check for down and up arrow, but I don't want to do that. While implementing this generic selection UI, I also want to make it work with joystick. Okay, so I'm not going to use the down and up arrow keys for the input. Instead, I'm going to use the input dot get access function and I'll check for the vertical input. Okay, let me just store this in a variable called v, and then I'll update our selected item by the vertical input. So since this is a float, we just want the sign of it. So I'll use mathf dot sign, and the sign still returns a float. So we have to convert it into an integer. Okay. And in the selection, when we press down, we want to increase the selected item, right? But when we press down, the value of the vertical axis will be negative. So we want to negate it. Okay. So this won't work perfectly. If we just write this, then the selection will happen too fast. So there are some more things that we need to do, but I'll be doing that once I show you the issue while testing. Okay. So let's just call this function from our handle update function. And then we need to clamp the value of the selected item to make sure that it doesn't go below 0 or above items.count. So let me just use mathf dot clamp function, and I'll clamp the selected item between 0 and items.count -1. Okay. So next, if the selected item was changed, then we have to update that change in the UI, right? So how can we check if the selected item was changed? We can just create a local variable here called previous selection and set it to the value of the select item. And after we run the code for changing the selection, we can check if it's not equal to the previous selection. Okay, that means the selection changed. So in that case, we need to update the selection in the UI. Okay, so I'll create another function for that. I'll call it update selection in UI. Okay, and in this function, I'll just loop through all our items and I'll change the selection of each one. Okay, so here the loop should be from 0 to items.count, and inside the loop, if the I is equal to the selected item, then we want to set that item as selected, and otherwise that item should not be selected, right? So how can we handle this from here? Here, the T can be anything, right? It won't always be a text, okay? So we can't just highlight the text color like we were doing before. The T here might be a button. In that case, we might want to change the background of the button, right? So how can we handle this? So what I'll do is I'll create a new interface called iSelectable item. Okay, so let me just get rid of the default code and let me make it an interface instead of a class. Okay, and this interface will have a function called on selection changed, which will also take a boolean to indicate if this item is selected or not. Okay, so now we can make different classes that implement this interface, and we can handle the selection change in different ways, right? So back in the selection UI, I'm going to use a where statement to make sure that the T should always implement the iSelectable item interface. Okay, so now from here, since we know that the item will always implement the iSelectable interface, we can just go ahead and call the onSelectionChange function. Okay, so first I'll get the item using the index, and then I'll call the onSelectionChange function. And to this function, we have to pass the selected value. So the selected value will be true if I is equal to the selected item, right? So we can just pass that. Okay, so here we're just calling the onSelectionChange function of the interface. The implementation for this can be different for different classes. Okay, so let's just call this function from here. All right, and next let's create an implementation for this iSelectable interface. So here I'll create a new script called text slot. So this class will be handling the type of selection where we simply highlight the text. Okay, so let me just get rid of the default code and I'll make it implement the iSelectable item interface. And when we do that, we also have to implement the onSelectionChanged function. So I'll use control dot and implement that. Okay, so from this function, we have to change the color of the text based on the value of this, right? So first we need to get a reference to the text. So let me just create a serialized field variable for that. Okay, and by the way, to use text, we have to import Unity engine.ui namespace. All right, so now based on the value of the selected boolean, we can set the color of the text. So if selected is true, then we'll use the highlighted color, which we have in our global settings, right? And otherwise, we should just use the original color of this text. So let's actually cast the original color from the awake function. So let me create a variable here and I'll cache its value from the awake function. I just made a typo here. So let me just fix the spelling of original. Okay. So now if it's not selected, then we can use the original color. Okay. So now we have the text slot. So we can use it to create selection UI where the color of the text changes based on the selection. Okay. And before we start implementing the selection UI, we need a way to set the list of items in the selection UI, right? So let me just create a public function for that. I'll just call this set items, and it will take a list of items. Okay, and from here I'll just set our private items list, and I'll also call update selection in UI just to make sure that the first item will be selected. Okay, so we're done with our selection code in the selection UI class. So let's try using our selection UI from our menu controller instead of using the old selection logic. So I'll just remove all the code in our menu controller. Okay, and I'll just make it inherit our selection UI class. Okay, and by the way, to use selection UI, we have to import the gd.generic selection UI namespace. Okay, and this selection UI is going to be of text slot type, right? So just by inheriting the selection UI, the menu controller will inherit the function to handle the selection. So we don't have to do that from the menu controller anymore. All we have to do is call the set items and pass the list of items, right? So let's go ahead and do that from the start function of the menu controller. So from here, I'll call set items, and we need to pass the list of text slot. So we can get that by calling get components in children and getting the text slot. And yeah, we also have to convert it into a list. So this is all we have to do from the menu controller, and the menu controller will automatically be able to handle the selection. So now let's use the menu controller from our game menu state, the state machine state that we created in the previous video. So from here, we have to get a reference to the menu controller. Okay, and in the enter function, I'll just make the menu controller active. Okay, and from the exit function, we have to make it inactive. So let me override the exit function. Okay, and from here, I'll just disable the menu. Okay, so finally, we also have to call menu controller dot handle update. So that will be the function which will handle the selection. Okay, so you can see how clean our code is right now, because the handle update function is not defined in menu controller anymore. It is defined in the selection UI, right? So our code will be a lot shorter and cleaner if all our selection classes just has to inherit the selection UI, right? We don't have to write any other selection logics anymore. We can just reuse this for all our selection. Okay, so now let's go ahead and set up the menu in Unity. And by the way, we have lots of errors because we removed all the code from the menu controller. So we can easily fix that by removing all the old reference of the menu controller. Okay, so we don't need any of this. All this will be handled by our state machine class. And we also don't need this. Okay, just calling state machine.execute will handle that. Okay, so now if we go back to Unity, all the errors should be gone. But looks like we have another error here. So let me also remove this line. Okay, so now hopefully all the errors should be gone. All right, so now let's set up our menu controller. So previously the menu controller script was attached to the game controller object. So let's remove that. We want the menu controller script in the menu itself. So let me go inside the UI canvas prefab and let me just disable the shop UI for now, and I'll enable the menu UI. Okay. So now we want the menu controller script to be on the menu, because from here we are enabling the game object to which the menu controller script is attached. So we have to attach it directly to the menu game object, and then to each menu item we have to attach the text slot class. Okay, so here we also have to assign the reference to the text. So let me just drag and drop the text component in here. Okay, so we have to repeat that for all the menu item. So I'll actually make this menu item a prefab. So I'll go to the games folder and I'll drag the menu item into the UI folder. And let me just rename this to menu item UI, just to be more clear. And now I can just remove all the other menu items and duplicate this prefab 3 times. Okay, so we just have to change the text here. So the second item is back, the third item is save, and the fourth item is load. Okay, so that's all we have to do. So now we have set up our menu to use the generic selection UI. So next, we also have to assign the menu controller reference in the game menu state. So let me go ahead and do that. And by the way, we don't want the menu to be active by default. So let me just disable it. And now let's try running the game. And hopefully the menu selection should work. Okay. So if I press enter from the free roam state, you can see that it opens the menu. And if I just try selecting different items in the menu, we have a problem here. The selection happens really fast. Okay. So that is something that we have to fix. So I had warned you about it while writing the code for the selection. If we just do this, then the selection will happen really fast. So what we have to do is we have to use a timer, and we have to wait for a small time, like 0.2 seconds, before we change the selection each time. Okay, so I'll do that by using a selection timer variable. Okay, I'll set it to 0 by default, and I'll only update the selected item if the selected timer is equal to 0, and if there is some value in the vertical input. Okay, so we can check that by taking the absolute value of the vertical input, and we can check if it's greater than 0, or we can even check if it's greater than a small value like 0.2. Just in case if you're using the joystick, we don't want to change the selection for small movements. So I'll just check if it's greater than 0.2. You can just use 0 if you want. This is just something that I prefer. Okay, so we'll only update the selected item if this condition is true. And once we update the selected item, I'll set the selection timer to a small value like 0.2, and we'll only be able to update the selected item again once the selection timer is back at 0. Okay, so we won't be able to update it for 0.2 seconds. So this will slow down the selection for us. So from the handle update function, we have to update the selection timer variable. So let me just create a separate function for doing that. Okay, and in here, I'll check if the selection timer is greater than 0. If so, we should decrement it by time.delta time, right? And while decrementing it, I'll also clamp it to make sure that the value of selection timer doesn't go below 0. Okay, so I'll just clamp it between 0 and the current value of the selection timer. The upper limit doesn't matter. Okay, so now we can call the update selection timer function from our handle update function. So now our selection should be much slower. There'll be a 0.2 seconds delay between each selection. So let's go to Unity and try testing it. Okay, so now it's much slower, and we can also just hold our up arrow button and it'll keep changing the selection slowly. Okay, so we didn't have this feature before. The selection only changed when we press the button, right? So now it will also change when we hold the button, which is a much better experience. Okay, and another amazing thing is that this selection will also work with a joystick. So you can go ahead and try plugging in a joystick and you should be able to select with the joystick. Okay, so that is awesome. And by the way, if you want, you can change the selection speed by playing around with the selection timer value. Okay, actually what we can do is we can create a constant variable called selection speed, and I'll set it to something like 5 by default. And in here, I'll set the value of selection timer to 1 divided by the selection speed. Okay, so now as we increase the selection speed, the value set to the selection timer will be lower and our selection will be faster. Okay, so yeah, you can go ahead and play with the selection speed and increase it or decrease it as per your need. All right, so yeah, now we're done with the selection, but right now our selection UI does not have any feature in which we can select an item and press Z, right? So pressing the Z and X button won't do anything in the selection UI right now. So we'll be adding that in the next video. So yeah, I'll stop the video here. Thanks a lot for watching. If you think this video is helpful, please leave a like and consider subscribing to my channel. That'll really help me out. And you can also support the series on Patreon if you can afford it. Alright, so I'll see you in the next video.